This is Capital Connection.
Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Cole Hankey. It is officially February, which means we're about a week and a half away until Governor Pritzker gives his State of the State address as well as his budget address. Joining us first today is Illinois' Chief Financial Officer, Comptroller Susana Mendoza. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Cole. Always a pleasure.
This is a very unique situation for the budget this year. Obviously, Governor Pritzker starting his second term. The state has had 4 straight years of balanced budgets and some credit upgrades to go along with that. But there's some signs that the economy may be turning the other way. I wonder, what do you anticipate from this speech from the governor? Is it going to be, more spending? Let's stay on the right track with these budgets, or is it going to be a little bit more reserved, a little bit more scaled back?
So first of all, I think it's wonderful that we've had balanced budgets for the last 4 years under Governor Pritzker. That has been such a blessing for the state. As controller, I've worked 2 years prior to that happening where we had no budget in place, 736 days, and that was terrible for the state's finances. And it was my job to turn that around in the 2 years before Governor Pritzker took office, which I started to do by chopping $9 billion off our $17 billion backlog and really starting that whole financial turnaround. And it's been great to have a governor that has been a partner instead of an adversary in that respect. But having said that, this next budget season is going to be critically important for the very same reasons you just stated. We are keeping an eye on what's happening to not just the state's economy, but this would be potentially an issue across the country. And while there is, cause for some concern, it's not something that is going to keep me up at night, because I can tell you that I think that a lot of the talk revolving around potential recession, it's not a large recession that people are talking about. Even your most conservative economist is not calling for a warning of a large recession, but a slowdown of some sorts is very possible. But given what we've done over the last few years to shore up the state's rainy day fund, which had less than $60,000 in it, remember, you've covered this before, Cole, when I first took office, it now has well over $1 billion. Just most recently in the supplemental bill that the governor signed and the legislature approved, they added another $850 million, which I will be putting together to make sure that we add to that rainy day fund, get us closer to $2 billion. And that's going to be helpful in the event of an economic downturn through no fault of our own. We are much better prepared to weather any storm that comes our way, although not as prepared as I'd like us to be, but we're getting there. 6 credit upgrades under my watch. No more bill backlog. We now have a working accounts payable of under $2 billion, which is tremendous. And we're paying our bills faster than ever. We have about a 10-day payment cycle on our bills. So I'm looking forward to the governor presenting a balanced budget like he has the last 4 years. And I think you can all sleep at night knowing that your controller knows what she's doing when it comes to managing the finances.
With the rainy day fund specifically, all of the real conversations around that and the push for more money to go in there started to gain a lot of traction and right when the pandemic was really starting, and like you said, $60,000 I think was the number you said. That is like worst case scenario, obviously, catastrophe, that the rainy day. That is the worst case scenario rainy day, I guess. I wonder, now that the fund has money in it, is that the situation you're preparing for? Is that the rainy day? Or is that potentially more for avoiding some small budget cutbacks that could happen in the time of an economic downturn?
So I think we have to be conservative with our approach always, right? This has been my mantra, that we be fiscally disciplined, that we exercise fiscal conservatism. That does not mean at the expense of taking care of what we need to first and foremost as a government, which is caring for the most vulnerable people in Illinois. That's an expensive proposition, one that we should not cut back on, because we're always going to have 16 years and they're never going to make the state money, right? But we have a moral obligation to take care of them. Same can be said for children or adults with disabilities, right? Illinois has to do a better job, as a matter of fact, of funding those initiatives because we have a moral obligation, and that is represented in a budget. So some things always cost more year to year. And I know that I'm going to be preaching to the choir because you guys cover these costs all the time. Healthcare is an expensive proposition that only keeps going up in cost instead of going down. So when we talk about seeing budgets sometimes increase in size, it's because these these aren't fixed costs, right? Every year we see increased costs on taking care of the most vulnerable, and those have to be reflected in budgets. That oftentimes increases the size of budgets. What we don't want to see is, frivolous spending, right? We don't want to see spending for new programs that might not be proven or tested programs that end up, being added to the budget year to year. This year's supplemental budget, while it was pretty large in size, it had a lot of one-time expenditures. And that makes sense when you have the money to afford them. But spending money on programs that are going to exist from here to eternity is not necessarily the best use of money all the time. We have to take care of our most vulnerable. That's expensive, and that should come first and foremost. And then we also need to save money for a rainy day. So we did have, it wasn't just raining, it was pouring, it was like a monsoon during the 736-day budget impasse, and there was no money to be able to help vendors get paid quickly. We had less than $60,000. That's why having more than $1 billion, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's less than a week's worth of reserves. The average state in the country has over 35 days worth of reserves. We need to be much closer to $5 billion to have 35 days worth of reserves. But our goal is to hit $3.75 billion, which in today's budget would be reflected as 7.5% of the budget. We have a $50 billion budget. 7.5% of that is $3.75 billion, more or less. And that would give us at least probably around 3 weeks worth of reserves, which is significantly more than we've ever had. The billion that we have today is more than we've ever had. But I use those numbers to educate the public that while $1 billion sounds like a lot, it's not enough to shore up our rainy day fund and really prepare us in the event of a tragic economic collapse, which I don't foresee coming soon, but that's why we need to be prepared in the event that it does happen a few years down the road.
Right now, everybody, all the Democrats in both legislative chambers, the governor and yourself, seem to be on the same page about putting money into the rainy day fund. Are there safeguards on that money? What's to stop, I guess, besides yourself, the legislature stepping in and saying, hey, you know what, let's take some of that money back?
Well, they would have to, pass legislation to do that. It's the controller's office that manages that rainy day fund, but the legislature also can order, or the governor per se, through legislation, how some of those funds are going to be used. But I do think that the fact that we're even having this discussion is great because it means we have some money in the rainy day fund. This is a discussion we wouldn't have been able to have, 5 years ago. And so today, this is good news, but I'm going to keep talking about the need to increase the state's rainy day fund. It does have a safeguard in place that if the money were to be utilized, it has to be paid back into the rainy day fund. The only caveat to that is that if we had a backlog of unpaid bills or accounts payable per se of over $4 billion, then that money would not have to be repaid to the state's rainy day fund because that would mean we're in massive crisis. My bill backlog is no longer alive, it's dead. We paid down all the bills. Today we have a working accounts payable of about $1.6 billion. The normal cost of running business in Illinois is anywhere between $2.5 to $3 billion. So 1.6 accounts payable means that we're totally current on paying our bills. My oldest bill today, as a matter of fact, is only 10 days old. So that's like speed paying. So Illinois is open for business. We're no longer a state that people should be looking at as like too risky to invest in, all the contrary. And this $1 billion or $1.6 billion, anywhere between 1.6, 2.6, that's totally good news. It means we're paying our bills on time. And we've been doing so for almost 2 years now. So this has, even during a pandemic, I had already paid down the bill backlog before even receiving a penny of federal stimulus funds. So that's just to give taxpayers an indication that fundamentally we are doing much better financially because of the skillful management, I would say, that my office has done over the 6 years that I've been in office. And I've taken the job very, very seriously. The governor has also been helpful in passing balanced budgets, which helps to control the bill backlog not getting out of control or once again rearing its ugly head, right? So those days of fiscal mismanagement hopefully are over, and you better believe I'm going to keep talking about how important it is to pass balanced budgets, to increase the state's rainy day fund, and also pay more towards pension stabilization, which is why I have legislation in place that would do both.
Part of the first real injection from the state into the rainy day fund came as a budget line item, just flat out in the budget. This is going to the rainy day fund.
Yes.
We could see that again in this year's budget. I think it's expected correct?
I certainly hope so. We just approved, the legislature and the governor just approved $850 million more in the supplemental, which it's going to be my job to put that money together and make sure we deposit it into the rainy day fund. That's quite a bit of money, right, to come up with $850 million. So every opportunity that I have, I'll be setting some money aside to put together that 850 and get it in the rainy day fund as soon as possible.
We've also started to see the state sort of get a little creative with how that money gets in there, most recently with the Unemployment Trust Fund repayment plan, a deal struck with the state, union, and business groups to really agree on how the state's going to pay in a bunch of money, and as that loan gets repaid, it goes to the rainy day fund. Is that you in the ear of people saying, what if we put the money there? Or
well, I would certainly hope so. I think that the advocacy that I've had on this, not just verbally, but actually introducing legislation, setting a savings goal of 7.5%, for example, that 7.5% savings goal that's in my bill has now been reflected in the supplemental. So even before passing my legislation, that number that I came up with of 7.5% is now the savings goal that the state of Illinois has set into law. So that's wonderful. And it shows that, these are conversations that we're all having amongst each other, that the need to save when our economy is doing well, when we have a growth larger than expected, instead of spending that money on new programming or things like that, we spend it by actually saving it and protecting the budget that gets passed year to year. Because let's remind people that a budget is what the legislature and the governor felt were the priorities for the state in terms of funding. If we get hit by another economic collapse through no fault of our own, and we see revenues depleted in the state of Illinois, then that means that that moral compass, that document, that budget, which is really the moral statement for the state of what we should fund, that all of those line items are put to risk. So having a rainy day fund that would allow me then to continue paying those vendors for the budget that was already approved, not new spending, but the existing spending that the state of Illinois is supposed to do, whether it's to Medicare or children and adults with disabilities or to schools or police and fire, whatever it is, that those line items don't all of a sudden start to feel the pinch of not getting paid on time. That's why having a robust rainy day fund is important, because it helps protect the appropriations that were passed in that budget. So, but once we hit like a 7.5% savings, right, I think that the better use of new revenues is to help pay down pensions and help stabilize that. Not only is saving important and stabilizing our pensions and codifying these things into law as minimum automatic deposits into both, I think it's going to catch the attention of the credit rating agencies and hopefully lead to our 7th credit upgrade just over the last few years. And remember, before I came here, we had 20 years of consecutive credit downgrades. So having 6 credit upgrades on my watch, with this legislature, with this governor, this is important forward progress for Illinois, and we have to keep that momentum going.
Your office also announced this week that paid back the rest of the unemployment trust fund loans that the federal government caved down during COVID. Is that the last of the money, the last of the debt the state was in from the pandemic? That
is. We're all caught up now with all COVID-related or pandemic-related borrowing, and that's tremendous. There's still a few other states that haven't finalized repaying the federal government, New York, Connecticut, and California, I think, but Illinois has now satisfied all our debts. And I'll remind you that we paid back we were the only state to borrow from the Federal Municipal League during the height of the pandemic, when we had a huge hole blown in our budget in the darkest days. And we had to go to the federal government and borrow money from them. But we repaid that loan in full 2 years early. It was something that I prioritized. And we paid that back 2 years early, saving taxpayers what would have been $83 million in interest. Paying down and settling the debt now on the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is also going to save about $20 million in interest. So the minute that was authorized by the state government, our legislature, and signed by the governor, that same day, I issued the payment for $1.37 billion. And that may not sound like a big deal, Cole, but it's a huge deal, because I have known that this has been coming for quite some time. What the day was that this bill was going to be finally agreed to and signed, we didn't know. But what I did know is that we had to pay this back. So rather than wait until the legislature came to an agreement with the governor and the business and labor groups, we started preparing for this day to come. And for 6 months now, I've been setting aside money to be able to pay the $1.37 billion on day one, stopping the interest for Illinois taxpayers. And that's another thing I'm very proud of.
I wonder, when the pandemic not when it first starts, but when that federal money starts to come in and the federal government really just starts to supplement a lot of the states and make sure they can get through this as well. What are those negotiations like? As you know, there's this windfall of money that comes in. The state obviously has plenty of places it could put it. You've already mentioned pensions and healthcare costs, things like that. But what are those negotiations like from your perspective when you're the one saying, we still got to pay this back down the line? Let's remember that.
Well, remember that I had already paid the backlog down before before any of the pandemic relief money came in, and that's what a lot of people forget. They think that the bill backlog was paid down with the federal money, but factually that's just inaccurate. I had already paid down the backlog of unpaid bills to well under $3 billion. It was now working accounts payable. We'd already gotten a few credit upgrades before the federal relief came into Illinois. So when that federal relief came in, remember it also had strings attached to it. We couldn't spend it on pensions. We couldn't spend it on a bill backlog. We were prohibited from that. So as a matter of fact, that's another reason why I can tell you that we did not use that money for the bill backlog. Again, there was no more bill backlog, but just to be clear, if there had been one, we wouldn't have been able to use it for that. You had strict requirements of being able to use it only for COVID-related expenditures. And thankfully, that's what we used it for. And most importantly, we're super transparent about it. Even in the darkest days of the pandemic, where no one was sleeping, I tasked my staff with publicizing on our website, on a special portal that we created for COVID spending, how every penny of it was being spent. You can track down to exactly how it was all done, down to the individual glove or mask or ventilators. We're super transparent about it and have actually been recognized nationally as the most transparent COVID-19 spending portal in the country. So again, very proud about never sacrificing transparency and taxpayer dollars to crisis. Especially in times of crisis, the people of this state need to know how their money is being spent. And so I can show you how we didn't spend that on backlog that had already been paid off. And thankfully, because I had done such a good job of managing us through the 736-day budget impasse, and then the year before the pandemic hit, right, was that we were in such a better place to withstand the pandemic. We wouldn't have survived it had the federal government not stepped up to help pay for COVID-related expenditures, right? We had no rainy day fund. Other states didn't have to borrow from the federal government because they had huge rainy day funds. We had none, so our only option at the lowest interest was to borrow from the federal government. It would have been more expensive for us to borrow from the markets. So we did what we could with the cards that we had been dealt. But I think the markets have clearly appreciated how I've navigated this financial crisis, as well as the governor, because we have received these credit rating upgrades in the process.
All right, well, Comptroller Susana Mendoza, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, thanks.
We'll be right back when we sit down with Democratic Senator L.G. Sims.